Ada for making a vegan cry and have a meltdown. Let me explain it all. I, a 33-year-old woman, have been a vegetarian for as long as I can remember. It's not something I wear like a badge of honor or a reason to look down on others. For me, it's simply a choice, a deeply personal one rooted in my own sense of morality, comfort, and preference. I've never felt the need to impose my beliefs on others, nor do I particularly enjoy engaging in debates about what someone else decides to put on their plate. My boyfriend, for example, eats meat. It's never been a point of contention in our relationship because we respect each other's boundaries. The only rule I've set is that he takes care of the cooking when it comes to meat. After years of living without it, the smell of cooking meat tends to turn my stomach, and this arrangement works well for both of us. Today, however, I found myself pulled into a battle I hadn't anticipated. It all started with a seemingly innocuous scroll through social media, a harmless pastime that, more often than not, spirals into something far from harmless. My feed presented me with a post that stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't just the content that gave me pause, but the sheer audacity of it. The post made an outrageous and offensive comparison. Meat eaters, it claimed, were no better than pedophiles. I could feel my face flush with anger and disbelief. It was the kind of statement designed to shock, to provoke, to paint the world in the starkest shades of black and white. To me, it represented everything wrong with certain corners of activism, a place where nuance dies and extremes take center stage. I couldn't stay silent. I left a comment, my fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the keyboard. I told the creator of the post that this kind of rhetoric was not only damaging but counterproductive. By painting meat eaters as villains in such an inflammatory way, they were alienating people who might otherwise be open to learning more about vegetarianism or veganism. They were, in essence, fueling the very attacks that vegetarians and vegans often face. It was a message born of frustration and a desire to see better discourse, but I should have known it wouldn't end there. The response came swiftly, not from the creator of the post, but from a woman who clearly had a bone to pick. Her words dripped with venom as she accused me of being a murderer, claiming that only vegans could truly claim moral purity. I was taken aback but not entirely surprised. This wasn't my first encounter with such hostility, though it never failed to sting. Still, I tried to respond calmly. I explained my position, detailing how I source my milk and eggs. I told her about the farm I support, where calves stay with their mothers and the chickens roam freely, enjoying more space and freedom than most pets. I thought this would demonstrate that I had put thought and care into my choices, that I wasn't blind to the ethical complexities of consuming animal products. But my explanation only seemed to fan the flames. She dismissed my efforts as meaningless, accusing me of complicity in the suffering of animals. She painted vivid, grotesque images of baby animals being torn from their mothers, as though my choices were directly responsible for such atrocities. Her words were sharp, relentless, and calculated to provoke guilt. I felt my patience wearing thin, but I tried to maintain a level head. I pointed out a simple truth. Without a rooster, there are no baby chicks. The eggs I consume aren't babies in any sense of the word. But she wasn't interested in logic. Her mission was to condemn, not to understand. As the conversation escalated, I found myself growing more and more frustrated. It wasn't just her accusations that bothered me, it was the hypocrisy. I couldn't help but wonder if she held herself to the same impossible standards she demanded of others. Did she know where her shampoo or makeup came from? Had she scrutinized every product she used to ensure it was truly vegan? Did she even realize how pervasive animal byproducts were in everyday items? These questions burned in my mind, and before I knew it, they spilled out in my response. I told her that if she was going to attack people so viciously for their dietary choices, she had better make sure her own house was in order first. My words were harsh, I'll admit, but they felt justified in the heat of the moment. I wasn't trying to hurt her, I was trying to make her see that her self-righteousness was built on shaky ground. But instead of continuing the argument, she fell silent. The absence of her vitriol was almost disconcerting, but I shrugged it off. Maybe she had realized the futility of the argument. Maybe she was taking a moment to reflect. Or maybe, just maybe, she had no answers to the points I had raised. I didn't think much more about it as I went about my day, but the interaction lingered in the back of my mind. It wasn't the first time I had encountered hostility from a militant vegan, but something about this exchange felt different. It wasn't just a clash of opinions, it was a glimpse into the darker side of activism, where compassion is often overshadowed by a need to control and condemn. I told myself I had done nothing wrong. If anything, I had tried to bring some perspective to a conversation that desperately needed it. Still, a small part of me wondered if I could have handled it better, if my words had been too sharp, too cutting. Hours later, I received a private message that reignited the firestorm. A friend of the woman I had argued with had taken it upon herself to lash out at me. She told me that her friend had suffered a complete mental breakdown after our exchange, triggered by the realization that her makeup and other products weren't vegan. The news stunned me. I hadn't anticipated such an extreme reaction, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But as I read on, the tone of the message shifted. The friend wasn't just informing me of what had happened, she was blaming me for it. She called me heartless, cruel, a monster who had pushed someone to the brink. She demanded that I apologize, not just for my words but for the very ideas I had shared. Her accusations hit like a punch to the gut, but as the initial shock wore off, I felt my anger rise. How was this my fault? How was it my responsibility to manage someone else's emotions, especially when that person had gone out of their way to attack me? I had only pointed out the hypocrisy in her arguments. If that truth was too much for her to handle, was I really the one to blame? These questions swirled in my mind as I crafted my response, determined not to let her accusations go unanswered. Well, that was clearly not enough for her, and the conversation only spiraled further into absurdity. She doubled down, accusing me of not just contributing to animal suffering but of perpetuating a culture of violence against innocent beings. Her claims became increasingly far-fetched, painting a vivid and melodramatic picture of baby animals falling helplessly, abandoned by their mothers, as if my morning omelette or cup of coffee was the sole architect of such tragedy. Her words were heavy with accusation, laced with an almost theatrical fervor, and I could feel my patience unraveling thread by thread. It wasn't bad enough that she had ignored my explanation about the lack of a rooster. It was as if logic and reason had no place in her crusade. To her, nuance didn't exist. There was only black and white, pure and impure, her side and everyone else's. At first, I tried to keep my tone measured. I pointed out again, as calmly as I could, that without a rooster, there are no baby chicks. The owner of the farm didn't even keep roosters, and the eggs I consumed were never destined to be anything but eggs. I mentioned again the ethical considerations I took when sourcing my milk and eggs, emphasizing the care and freedom afforded to the animals. But it didn't seem to matter. She dismissed my reasoning as excuses, accusations of eating babies still flying with relentless fervor. It felt less like a discussion and more like an inquisition, and I was the heretic being dragged to the pyre. Frustration boiled over, and I found myself no longer willing to placate her self-righteous anger. If she was going to attack me so aggressively, I thought, she should at least have her own principles sorted out. So, I asked her pointedly and without sugarcoating whether she truly understood the full scope of what she was preaching. Did she know, for example, whether her shampoo or conditioner was vegan? Had she looked into the origin of her makeup, her nail polish, her shoes, her clothes? Had she ensured that every single product she consumed or used in her daily life adhered to the impossibly high standards she demanded of others? Because if she was going to sit on her throne of moral superiority, she had better be certain it wasn't propped up by the very hypocrisy she claimed to despise. There was a pause, a moment of silence that felt heavier than the storm of accusations that had preceded it. For a split second, I thought perhaps I'd managed to break through, that my words had given her something to consider. But instead of engaging, she vanished. The thread grew quiet, and her relentless tirade came to an abrupt halt. For a while, I sat staring at the screen, a mix of relief and unease washing over me. Had she walked away out of frustration, realizing she couldn't argue further? Or had I crossed some invisible line? Either way, the debate was over, or so I thought. Hours later, when I had all but forgotten the exchange, my phone buzzed with a private message. The notification filled me with a sense of foreboding. It was from someone I didn't recognize, a friend of the woman I had argued with earlier. The message was long, rambling, and filled with rage. Apparently, my words had caused her friend to have a complete breakdown. According to the message, the woman had spiraled into an emotional meltdown upon realizing that many of the products she used weren't vegan. This discovery, they claimed, had shattered her worldview. She was inconsolable, throwing what was described as a full-blown tantrum and struggling to cope with the weight of her newfound guilt. I read the message twice, trying to wrap my head around the sheer intensity of the reaction. On one hand, I felt a pang of guilt. It had never been my intention to hurt her or to push her into a state of distress. All I had wanted was to point out the hypocrisy in her arguments, to remind her that no one, not even the most militant vegan, is without flaws. But on the other hand, I couldn't help but feel that the situation was being blown out of proportion. Was it really my fault that she hadn't done her research, that she hadn't realized the extent to which animal byproducts permeate everyday life? I had only asked questions she clearly hadn't considered before launching her crusade against others. The friend, however, didn't see it that way. She called me heartless, cruel, a monster who had intentionally inflicted harm. She accused me of causing irreparable damage to her friend's mental health and demanded that I apologize. Her words were sharp, dripping with anger and moral condemnation. I could feel the heat rising in my chest as I read, a mix of anger and defensiveness bubbling to the surface. Was I really the villain here? Was I truly responsible for the emotional fallout of someone who had gone out of their way to attack and shame others? I took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, but I also didn't want to stoop to the same level of vitriol I had faced earlier. Still, I couldn't let the accusations go unanswered. I crafted my response carefully, my words firm but measured. I told the friend that while I sympathized with her friend's distress, it wasn't fair to place the blame solely on me. Her friend had chosen to attack others viciously and without hesitation and had set herself up as the arbiter of morality. If she had been unprepared to face scrutiny of her own actions, that wasn't my fault. I had merely pointed out the inconsistencies in her arguments, not out of malice, but in the hope of fostering a more thoughtful discussion. I went on to say that perhaps this experience could be a turning point for her friend, a chance to re-evaluate her approach and focus on self-awareness rather than judgment. After all, no one is perfect, and we all have blind spots. The key is to recognize them and strive to do better, rather than tearing others down in a misguided attempt to elevate ourselves. I ended my message with a reminder that activism should be rooted in compassion, not cruelty, and that if her friend wanted to make a difference, she needed to start by treating others with respect. As I hit send, I felt a sense of closure, though the unease lingered. I knew my words wouldn't change their opinion of me. To them, I would always be the villain of this story, the catalyst for their friend's breakdown. But deep down, I knew I had done my best to handle the situation with integrity. I wasn't perfect, far from it, but I wasn't the monster they made me out to be, either. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on the entire ordeal. It was a stark reminder of how easily social media can escalate conflicts, turning minor disagreements into full-blown battles. It also highlighted the dangers of self-righteousness and the importance of humility. No one has all the answers, and we all have room to grow. But growth requires open-mindedness and a willingness to listen, qualities that were sorely lacking in this exchange. In the end, I chose to let it go. I couldn't control how others perceived me or how they chose to handle their own emotions. All I could do was stay true to my values and continue striving for a balance between ethics and empathy. The experience left me with a bitter taste, but also a renewed sense of clarity. Sometimes, the loudest voices in the room are the least willing to listen, and no amount of reasoning can reach those who refuse to see beyond their own perspective. Apparently, that's where it all went wrong. The vegan lady's sudden silence, which I initially chalked up to the end of a pointless argument, turned out to be the precursor to something much more dramatic. Hours later, as I went about my evening with a sense of weary relief that the online clash had concluded, I received a private message that reignited the whole ordeal. The message was from a friend of the woman, and it was written in the kind of all-caps fury that could almost make you hear someone shouting through the screen. My initial reaction was confusion. What did this person want from me now? Had I unknowingly opened Pandora's box? The friend began with a scathing tirade about how I had triggered a complete mental breakdown in the vegan lady. According to her, my comments about checking one's shampoo, makeup, and other products for animal byproducts had sent her spiraling into an uncontrollable emotional meltdown. She had apparently stormed through her bathroom and vanity, tearing through bottles, compacts, and tubes, discovering with horror that most of the products she owned were not vegan. This revelation, the friend claimed, had shattered her to the core. She was described as throwing tantrums, sobbing, screaming, and unable to calm herself down. The friend painted a picture so extreme and chaotic that for a moment, I wondered if it was a joke or some kind of exaggeration. But no, it was clear from the furious tone of the message that this friend fully believed I was the sole villain in this story. As I kept reading, the accusations mounted. I was called heartless and cruel, a monster who had deliberately pushed the woman into this state of despair. The friend even suggested that I owed not just an apology but some kind of active reparations, whatever that might mean in the context of an online spat. I was being held accountable for someone else's emotional inability to process the truth of her own lifestyle choices, and I was furious at the absurdity of it all. My initial reaction was to ignore the message altogether. It felt ridiculous, like the kind of drama that thrives on attention, and I didn't want to feed into it. But the longer I sat with it, the more I felt a slow, simmering anger build inside me. I wasn't the type to back down from a fight, especially not one where I felt I had been unfairly vilified. This was not the first time I had faced hostility for my choices, but it was certainly the most overblown reaction I'd encountered. If anyone was at fault here, it wasn't me, it was the vegan lady herself. She had chosen to go on the offensive, to attack others with the kind of self-righteousness that brooked no disagreement. And when confronted with her own shortcomings, she had crumbled under the weight of her own hypocrisy. That wasn't on me. With that in mind, I decided to respond. I wasn't going to let myself be bullied into silence, nor was I going to apologize for something I didn't feel I had done wrong. My response was measured but firm, each word chosen carefully to make my point without stooping to the level of personal attacks. I told the friend that while I sympathized with her friend's emotional turmoil, it was ultimately her own fault. She had decided to weaponize her beliefs and attack people online, throwing around accusations of murder and moral impurity without regard for how they might affect others. If she hadn't been prepared to face scrutiny of her own actions, then perhaps she shouldn't have been so quick to pass judgment on others. I didn't stop there. I pointed out that the vegan lady's breakdown was not a result of my words but rather a consequence of her own lack of self-awareness. She had chosen to lash out at others, assuming a position of moral superiority, only to discover that her own choices didn't align with the very standards she was preaching. That kind of realization can be jarring, sure, but it's not my responsibility to cushion the blow for someone who refuses to engage in constructive dialogue. I ended my message with a blunt piece of advice. If she wanted to avoid such meltdowns in the future, she might consider focusing on her own journey instead of policing the choices of others. Perhaps then, she could approach her beliefs with the kind of compassion and self-reflection that true advocacy requires. I expected backlash, and it came swiftly. The friend's reply was even more venomous than the first message, accusing me of being callous and cruel, of lacking empathy for someone who was clearly struggling. She doubled down on her insistence that I apologize, not just to her friend but to the broader vegan community, as though my comments had somehow insulted every vegan on the planet. I could feel my blood boil as I read her words, but I knew better than to keep engaging. This was a battle I could never win, not because I was in the wrong, but because people like this thrived on outrage. They weren't interested in resolution, they wanted validation, a public apology that would reinforce their sense of moral superiority. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Still, the whole ordeal left a sour taste in my mouth. I found myself replaying the argument in my mind, questioning whether I could have handled it differently. Could I have been kinder in my approach, less blunt in my responses? Perhaps. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that no amount of gentleness would have changed the outcome. The vegan lady's meltdown wasn't about me, it was about her own inability to reconcile her beliefs with the reality of her actions. She had built her identity around the idea of moral purity, and when that illusion was shattered, she had no tools to cope with the fallout. I could empathize with that to a degree, but I couldn't take responsibility for it. As the days went on, the incident continued to weigh on me. It wasn't the argument itself that bothered me. I had long since accepted that debates about ethics and morality were rarely productive. What gnawed at me was the sheer hostility and lack of nuance that had defined the entire exchange. Social media, I realized, had become a breeding ground for this kind of toxic interaction, a place where people felt emboldened to attack others without consequence. It was a reminder of why I usually avoided engaging in such debates, and I resolved to be more cautious in the future. But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the lingering frustration. It wasn't just about the vegan lady or her friend, it was about the broader culture of judgment and division that seemed to dominate conversations about ethical living. As someone who had spent years navigating my own journey toward more ethical choices, I knew how complicated and messy it could be. No one gets it right all the time, and that's okay. What matters is the effort, the willingness to learn and grow without tearing others down in the process. In the end, the incident became a lesson for me, a reminder to stay true to my values while recognizing that not everyone shares the same perspective. It also reinforced my belief in the importance of leading by example rather than preaching from a pedestal. If we want to inspire change, we need to approach it with humility and empathy, not with judgment and condemnation. And perhaps most importantly, we need to remember that perfection is not the goal, progress is. The friend's words lingered like an unpleasant echo in my mind. Heartless. Monster. Ah. Burning in hell. The intensity of the accusations felt disproportionate, almost surreal, but they still left a bitter aftertaste. For a brief moment, I considered whether I truly had been too harsh. Should I have softened my tone, taken a gentler approach? After all, I had inadvertently exposed a blind spot in someone else's life, something they clearly weren't prepared to face. But then I reminded myself of how it had all started, how the vegan lady had lashed out at me and others with inflammatory accusations, calling us murderers and elevating herself to a pedestal of supposed moral superiority. Could I really be blamed for pointing out the cracks in that pedestal when she had invited scrutiny with such open hostility? I sat with those questions for a while, replaying the entire ordeal in my head like a movie I couldn't turn off. Each scene sharpened the conclusion I was slowly coming to. No, I didn't owe anyone an apology. I had responded to an unprovoked attack with reason and facts, albeit delivered with a bit of bluntness. My words may have struck a nerve, but that didn't make them untrue. If anything, I felt that the vegan lady's meltdown was a direct result of her own unchecked behavior, a lesson in the dangers of throwing stones from a glass house. Her friend's demands for an apology felt less like a genuine call for reconciliation and more like an attempt to shift the blame onto me, to absolve the vegan lady of any responsibility for her actions. Still, I couldn't deny that the whole situation left me feeling unsettled. It wasn't just about the argument or the accusations, it was the realization that we lived in a world where conversations about ethics, morality, and personal choices had become battlegrounds. Social media, with its tendency to amplify outrage and polarize opinions, had turned what could have been a constructive dialogue into an all-out war. And I had been dragged into the middle of it, left to grapple with the aftermath of someone else's emotional spiral. In the days that followed, I chose not to engage further. The friends' messages went unanswered, their accusations left to fester in the void. I knew that responding again would only pour fuel on the fire, and I had no desire to prolong the drama. Instead, I focused on finding peace within myself, on reconciling my actions with my values. I wasn't perfect, none of us are, but I knew I had acted out of frustration, not malice. And while I could have been more tactful, I also believed that the vegan lady needed to hear the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. Growth, after all, often comes from moments of discomfort. The experience left me reflective, not just about the argument itself but about the broader dynamics of human interaction. It made me think about the ways we engage with each other, especially in spaces like social media where anonymity and distance can strip away empathy. It's so easy to forget that there are real people on the other side of the screen, people with their own struggles, insecurities, and blind spots. And yet, it's also easy to forget that holding someone accountable doesn't make you the villain. Sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is tell someone the hard truth, even if it hurts. Over time, the incident faded into the background of my life, a small blip in the grander scheme of things. But its lessons stayed with me. I learned to be more mindful of how I communicate, to balance honesty with empathy. I also learned to recognize when an argument isn't worth engaging in, when the cost of speaking up outweighs the potential for positive change. Some battles simply aren't worth fighting, not because the cause isn't important but because the audience isn't willing to listen. As for the vegan lady, I never heard from her again. Whether she took the opportunity to reflect on her actions and grow from the experience, I'll never know. Maybe she continued on the same path, lashing out at others with the same self-righteousness that had ignited our conflict. Or maybe, just maybe, she started to question the rigid framework she had built around herself, realizing that morality isn't a zero-sum game and that no one is perfect, not even her. I hoped for the latter, but I knew better than to count on it. In the end, the question of whether I was the remained unresolved, at least in the court of public opinion. Some would say I was, for the bluntness of my words and the emotional fallout they caused. Others would argue that I was justified, that the vegan lady had brought it upon herself with her attacks and hypocrisy. For me, the answer was somewhere in between. I wasn't proud of how the situation had unfolded, but I wasn't ashamed of it, either. I had stood my ground, spoken my truth, and refused to be bullied into silence. And in a world where silence often enables the loudest voices to dominate, that felt like a small but meaningful victory. Life moved on, as it always does, carrying me forward into new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities for growth. The memory of that argument remained a reminder of the complexities of human interaction, a testament to the power of words and the responsibility that comes with wielding them. And while I couldn't change the past, I could strive to do better in the future, to navigate the delicate balance between honesty and compassion with a little more grace. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do: learn, grow, and keep moving forward.